Hey robot makers! Raspberry Pis are really hard to get hold of at the moment in 2022, so I bought myself a Raspberry Pi 4 compute module. So let's take a closer look. So this show is all about the Raspberry Pi 4 compute module and also the development board. So what is it? What kind of features does it have? How is it different than a regular Raspberry Pi 4? How do we actually install the operating system onto the eMMC onboard storage? They are still available, so if you're looking to try and get yourself a Raspberry Pi, you can buy the compute modules. This one is available at the moment from Seed Studios in China. Just took a couple of weeks for this one to arrive. And we'll talk about the price in totality at the end as well, and some of the quirks with this board as well. So the features of this board. So it's even more like a desktop PC. It actually comes in two parts. So there is the compute module itself, and then there is the development board which it connects into. And the idea is that other companies can create development boards and that you can plug several of these compute modules into the board and have several cores on that machine. The development board, this is one of the quirks. It has an external power connector. So it runs on 12 volts plus 5 volts as well. So I've used an LED connector, which was powering some lights in the back of the room because I didn't have an official power supply. And in fact, there isn't an official power supply for the compute module. You just have to find one with a barrel connector from your local supplier. So it does come with two full-size HDMI connectors, which is really great if you want to have some monitors and you haven't got the very small connectors that come on the Raspberry Pi 4. So you can use standard HDMI cables, which are much easier to get hold of. It does have two USB connectors with a header for an additional two USB connectors, so making that 4 in total. It has gigabit Ethernet via the RJ45, and it does have power over Ethernet support as well, which is really great. So you could actually power the board just by PoE. It has a micro USB socket, but this isn't for powering it. This confused me at first when I tried powering up the board, and nothing responded. This is simply a slave connector so that you can actually update the compute module. And it has a micro SD card slot as well. It does have a micro SD card socket if you buy the compute module without the eMMC onboard storage, so you can use it just like a regular Raspberry Pi. And it also has, which no other Raspberry Pi has, a PCIe Generation 2 socket as well. It has a standard fan connector, a bit like the fan connectors that you'll find on a regular PC case, the 4-pin. It has two display adapters, which is unusual, so you can have two displays running from the DSI connectors. And it also has two CSI camera connectors as well, so you can run two cameras independently on this. So I'm thinking for robotics, that means we can have stereo vision. It has the standard 40-pin Raspberry Pi hack connector on it as well, so it'll run with all the peripherals that we have already. And it has a real-time clock with a battery socket as well, so it's able to wake up the compute module. So this is a real benefit if you have a Raspberry Pi that's not connected to a network and you want it to keep time accurately. And it has various jumpers for disabling specific features on the board. So for example, when we want to flash the storage, we have to put a header pin on to block it from booting from the eMMC memory. And we also have EEPROM writing as well. So it comes in quite a few flavors. You can have the compute modules without Wi-Fi or with Wi-Fi. You can have them with 1, 2, 4 or 8 gigs of RAM, and you can also have none, 8, 16 or 32 gigs of eMMC storage as well, and various different combinations of those two. So I've gone for the 2 gig of RAM, 32 gig storage with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Installing the OS on the eMMC storage is actually quite complicated. Now, Jeff Geerling did a really great video on how to do this, so I'd recommend you watch through that. But here's some of the highlights of doing this from a Raspberry Pi. This is how I've done it. You can do it on a Windows machine or also on a Mac. I had trouble getting this to work on an M1 Mac, so I actually used a Raspberry Pi 400 to do the install. And what we have to do is connect up our compute module using the slave USB connector to our Raspberry Pi. Then we need to install the libusb library. So we do sudo apt install libusb-1.0-0-dev, and that will install the library that we need to do the USB boot. Then we need to get some code from the Raspberry Pi Git repository, so go to git clone https github.com/raspberrypi/USB boot. Once that's downloaded, go into the USB boot folder that's just been created, type in make, that will build the RPI boot loader, and then do /RPI boot to make that program work. And what will happen, you'll see some text appear on the screen, and then you can use the Raspberry Pi imager to install the 64-bit version of the OS. So if you haven't got the RPI imager installed on your Raspberry Pi, then the last command there is sudo apt install rpi-imager, and that will grab the Raspberry Pi imager and install it on your Raspberry Pi. So some of the quirks, like I said at the very beginning, flashing the MMC storage, really not straightforward at all. At the very least, I would have expected, given that they've got this new remote installer, that it would, as soon as you've connected in a network connection, it could pull an image down onto the eMMC storage, or maybe just have a version installed on there, at least a bootloader installed on there to begin with, rather than absolutely nothing. The power is a 12-volt barrel connector, and there is no official power supply, and I found this quite frustrating. I looked in all the supply channels to see what kind of connector I needed to get for this. So why they chose the barrel connector and then don't provide an official power supply. They even provide a Lego hat power supply as an official power supply, so why not provide a 24-watt power supply for the compute module? I don't know. The USB slave cable can't be used to power the Pi. Again, this seems like an oversight to me. It's such a simple thing. All the Raspberry Pis up to the version 4 had used the micro USB, so why not enable that? And I was scrabbling around trying to find a connector that would work, and luckily I had one. And then the header pins, they don't come with any of the small headers. These little pins that you use to connect, to short together two header pins, it doesn't come with any of those, yet they're essential if you want to flash the eMMC storage, which of course you would do. So very confused about that. So let's get to an unboxing and have a closer look at this. Okay, so just to compare the size, on my desk here I've got, there's the compute module as it comes in the box, and there's a regular Raspberry Pi. I think this is a Raspberry Pi, what does that say, Raspberry Pi 1.2, there's a Raspberry Pi 0, so this thing comes in a kind of, looks like a matchbox. So let's open this up. They've really made the packaging quite small. You can see there that the compute module is just inside there. There are the two connectors on the back, and this is what the module looks like. So this chip here is the eMMC storage. This is the main chip here, and I think this is the Wi-Fi as well. So that's the compute module, and then this huge box here is the development board. So this thing is huge. Let's compare this to the size of our regular Raspberry Pi, and there's also a Raspberry Pi 0 for comparison. So the first thing we need to do is push these connectors into these sockets here. Now, what I was saying about the header pins, if you want to update eMMC storage chip, you have to put a header pin on there, and that says on there that this jumper will disable booting from the eMMC storage. This is where we have the real-time clock battery. We can connect a battery in there. We've got the two HDMI full-size connectors there. We have the Ethernet, two USBs, and this is a USB header here where we can put in some additional USB. This is the micro USB slave connector, and this is where we put the SD card if we don't have the boot memory on there. And then this is the barrel connector. This is where we power it, so it's just a 12 volts going into there. This is the PCI connector, so if we have a fancy graphics card we can plug that into there if that's a generation 2 PCI connector E. This is the fan connector, and this is an external PSU connector. So if you've got a PC power supply, this is designed to be like a mini motherboard. We also have a bunch of connectors along the side here. Two of these are the camera 0 and camera 1, so we can have two cameras at the same time, and we also have display 0 and display 1, so we can have two separate displays connecting to that as well. And then we have the 40-pin header, and then there's a couple of other jumpers there for connecting the cameras, camera 0 and display 0. So let's connect this up and get this running. So the activity light there is flashing away, which means that this is booting up correctly, and I have another screen over here which I can see which is displaying the Raspberry Pi desktop. Now it does actually boot very, very quickly, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to connect to it using the VNC software. So let me just connect to this. So this is now the compute module, so we can prove this. If we go to the terminal and we type pinout, we can always get all the information about the current Raspberry Pi that we're on. So I just scroll down here, you'll see this huge I/O board as they call it, and we can see there that it's got the eMMC, it's got the Wi-Fi there, and if we scroll down it says it's the 2 gig version. It's got eMMC off-board storage, has two USBs, one Ethernet running at a gigabit, has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and it has two camera ports and two display ports as well. So because it's running on the eMMC storage, that seems to be quite a bit faster than the flash storage that we normally use on one of these flash cards. So that means that we get that little bit of extra speed boost when we're booting this up, and we don't have to worry about the card either. either. It's all built onto the board, so it's a little bit more robust. So we can install all the usual kind of programs on here. I've not got anything fancy loaded at the moment, but we can load up Thonny, for example. You can see there that's pretty snappy to load up. So let's have a look how much these cost. So I'm going to go over to the RPI locator. So this is the Raspberry Pi locator, the rpilocator.com. And we can actually see there are some Raspberry Pi 4s available as we speak. I just bought a Raspberry Pi 4 2 gig from here, from the Pi Hut. So that was £43. But you can see there that from the Pi shop, which is based in China, they have quite a few Raspberry Pi Compute Module 4's 2 gig version with no onboard storage and no Wi-Fi. The one I bought was around £50. See if we can find that. So from Seed Studio. So this is the model that I bought, which, if I just move my face out the way for a second, is from Seed Studio, and it's the 2 gig of RAM, 32 gig MMC with Wi-Fi, and that was £50 UK. Now let's go and have a look and see if we can find how much it costs for the development board. So let's go over to Pimoroni and let's type in compute module and see how much that costs. So they have them in stock at the moment. These are £33.30. So for around £83 with a bit of shipping, you can get yourself a Raspberry Pi 4 today. And when the other Raspberry Pi 4s are no longer available, these are still available. These are not in high demand at the moment. So you can have quite a lot of fun with the development board and do some things that you can't do on a regular Raspberry Pi, such as have the real-time clock, have 2 cameras, 2 displays, and have power over Ethernet without actually having a hat. So I hope you enjoyed this short video on the Raspberry Pi 4 compute module, and I shall see you next time. Bye for now.